So this is a recognition of the major challenges that we face in our coastal and estuarine environments. Currently, we're trying to increase our knowledge with such funds. And where do we want to be? We want to be at a stage where farm payments are for public goods. If we can prove a piece of land is productive with nature-based solutions, for example, salt marsh acting as a buffer to coastal defences, and nature-based solutions to be the go-to approach, to be added to all projects. Part of this will require funding to be generated from the approaches, which is why the Investment Readiness Project and Natural Capital approach is so important. We need to encourage businesses to fund these approaches. So let's have a look at some examples of our learning. So one of the funds I just discussed was the Innovative Resilience Fund. And we've got two successful projects in our area, but I'm going to focus on the one in Cornwall. So Cornwall Council successfully secured funding to protect sand dunes, which will act as a vital sea defence for coastal communities. Cornwall was one of 25 areas in England in line to benefit from a share of the £150 million funding through the Flood and Coastal Innovative Resilience Programme. The successful bid is called Building Community Resilience on a Dynamic Coast by Making Space for Sand. So the project, hosted by Cornwall Council, could attract as much money as £1 million per year of funding from DEFRA over the next 6 years. This project recognises that coastal sand dunes are important natural sea defences. The sustainability of many of our beaches is dependent upon the health of the sand dunes that lie behind them. So this project will provide state-of-the-art assessments of Cornwall's past, present and future sandy beach dune systems. And it will use cutting-edge coastal modelling tools to simulate and visualise future coastal change and work with communities to help sustain a coastal sand dune system. So a total of 40 sandy beaches, sandy beach dune locations around the Cornish coastline can be seen here in this map, have been identified as having sustainability issues and will be subject to state-of-the-art dunes assessment. Many of these will then benefit from further modelling, monitoring and management and adaptation planning. So this case study is an example of how we are learning for the future in how to fund nature-based solutions. So let's have a little look at some of the funding issues. Now these are particular for the coast. I know we had some questions in our last group about sites not on the coast, but let's focus on these for now. So the coast consists of many highly interconnected landscapes and seascapes and a diverse mix of ownership and governance arrangements. There's economic competition for space, and that places multiple stresses on coastal and estuarine environments and can result in coastal squeeze and habitat loss. The small communities in these locations mean our ability to fund these locations is lower. Lots of our funding relies on the high house numbers to get money in. The size of the community also means we are limited with other funding options that might be more appropriate in an urban environment, such as contacting large businesses for contributions, looking at supply chains and utility providers. Lots of our coastal locations are deprived. There's little money and appetite for this kind of work. And lots of the populations in these locations are transient, so they're holiday makers, and this means they are less likely to contribute to a scheme in a location. Sometimes it can be difficult to show the immediate link or impact between the location and nature-based solutions. With nature-based solutions, it's hard to link the benefits to the location at risk. When investors and the public cannot see the approach taken, for example, a wall, there can be an issue of trust with the system. Some investors, such as private companies, may want to fly a flag from an intervention, and this is harder to do when the solution is less visual. It's hard to move away from this traditional approach to more nature-based solutions. Urgency is important. So the timing of interventions on the coast is hard to specify. We're moving from epochs in shoreline management plans to tipping points, but it's very hard to plan for event-driven changes. Funding needs to be flexible to account for this, which is very hard when you're putting together a programme of funding. And the scale of impact is important. So on the coast, if there's a big event, it's likely to impact lots of our locations, not just one. And then we have to consider which locations would get funding. And finally, adaptation. Most of the services in these communities are in the vulnerable zone. We need to start thinking about moving communities, but this has very hard funding implications. Who pays? So in conclusion, we have had the aspirations to fund nature-based solutions in the past, but not the ability due to funding and policy rules. We're moving to this through knowledge and new funds paving the way. With areas of growth and regeneration proposed in many of our coastal communities, sustainability to flood and coastal issues should be inherently built into the thinking of these locations to enable a greener and sustainable economy to be built and to increase overall community resilience over time. Okay. Hopefully that was an interesting canter through the UK funding model. Now I'd like us to move into the discussion element of this. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen so I can see you all. Okay.
Thanks, Chloe. We've had a couple of people have said where they're from. We've got Rashid from Kirklees Council. I'm not actually too sure where that is, so it'd be quite interesting to know where Kirklees is. And we've got Neil Nutt, who is down in Devon and Cornwall area, who works on Environment Agency projects. Thanks everyone for your discussions. I've got a question to start the discussion, if that's all right to put to everyone.
Go for it, Millie.
So your presentation, Chloe, was mainly on sort of the challenges, that last slide, the challenges in Cornwall and Devon, about mainly how we have transient populations and small communities that we're trying to fund, and that can be quite a challenge. I was wondering if anybody in the room is from another part of, well, Europe or the UK, where you don't have small communities, but you implement nature-based solutions into your projects, and if that's not a challenge for you. We've got a hand raised.
I think Will had his hand up before you started, actually. Will,
that's right. Sorry, yeah. It wasn't related to that, so sorry. I'll hang fire.
Is anyone from a community that's not as rural at all?
We're all working in small communities by the looks of it, Millie.
Well then we'll move to your question then.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Will Todd. I work at the Environment Agency in East Anglia. I think obviously, Chloe, at the start, there's a focus on how that grant and aid is available based on the benefits. I'd be interested to hear how you quantify your benefits, because I really struggle with probably more, admittedly, the fluvial side of nature-based solutions and natural flood management, how those benefits can be quantified without spending exorbitant amounts of money on modelling, which, as we found, doesn't actually always give you an answer anyway.
Well, I think that's, to be honest, I think that's part of the issue at the moment. I don't have a great answer for that, I'm afraid, but I think that's part of the problem with nature-based solutions as it is. And I guess I'm hoping that some of these pilot projects are going to help with some of that ability to quantify those benefits. It's incredibly difficult to attach a value to a nature-based solutions in terms of how much that's going to protect a community, and I think that's part of the issue. And that's to do with our current policy, I think, and how we value those. So unless anyone else has got any suggestion, I've got another hand up, which I think went up just as you asked your question, Will, but I can't see who it was.
Hi all, it's Mike Adams.
Oh, thanks, Mike.
So I'm an appraisals lead at Jacobs, but I'm seconded into the Environment Agency. So it's with a sort of Environment Agency hat on that I'm in this session primarily. My question was really an extension of Will's, to be honest, which was not just the quantification of benefits as a sort of for a given set of interventions, but also how we manage the variability that we'd expect in those benefits over time, because obviously by the very nature of nature-based solutions, it is a variable sort of set of interventions that we put in play. And yeah, just any thoughts people had around how we sort of build that that adaptable benefit picture into our sort of adaptive strategies as we move forward to try and deliver against the strategy.
Yeah, really interesting point. I'll open that up to anyone if they've got any suggestions.
Chloe, I can go. Oh, sorry, Roy, would you like to go?
Yeah, it's not a it's not a very helpful suggestion, I suspect. But just having sat in the natural capital laboratory session this morning, and they're into year 3, and they still can't really demonstrate with any clarity or soundness of what the benefits are. So it's about how long does this thing take. To me, there's a bit around common sense here. I mean, I remember the Pont-Bren trials, which must be about 25-30 years ago now, which was fairly basic in the data that it produced. But essentially, you know, if you stand under a tree, you don't get as wet as if you're standing outside of it. And we've got to take a leap of faith somewhere at some point, because it seems that we're just in this continuous loop of, oh, we're doing another pilot, we need to check out what's what, and the world is changing quicker than any of us would have imagined. And we've got our own chair now who's saying, you know, change or die kind of thing. And at some point, somebody has to make that move. And I just we're not mature enough yet in terms of our policies and processes and all the rest of it to take that leap of faith. So I just wonder, who will it be who kind of blinks first on this?
That is a really good point, Roy. And I think Emma Howard Boyd's statement, you know, adapt or die, I wonder if that almost gives us the opportunity to be bolder, to kind of try and pave the way a little bit. But yeah, who steps out in the middle of that road first is quite a difficult suggestion, isn't it? It's uncomfortable for the Environment Agency, I think, to be doing that, but it is how we're going to have to move. Will, did you have a comment on that?
Yeah, yeah, thanks. It's a really good point. I think it's a really valid one, Roy. And I think the challenge for us is how our assurance and, you know, approval processes take that into account. Because at the moment, it's incredibly rigid about moving flood risk categories in order to open up that grant in aid. And if you can't demonstrate that, then it doesn't open it up. So there's a real onus on that evidence. But that's the challenge. You know, how do we get that evidence in a proportionate way, or do we just accept that something is good enough and it's going to have some positive benefit, and hope, you know, and no negative benefits, and therefore let's go with it? But it's how we incorporate that into our assurance of projects to release that grant in aid. That's the challenge.
Mike?
Just on that, for me, I think half the problem, and I understand why we're in this place, but we try and assure nature-based solutions in exactly the same way that we would assure a £20 million linear defence flood alleviation scheme, and they're two different things that offer two different sets of benefits. And I think there needs to be a recognition of that through the assurance process. And I completely agree with you. We'll have exactly the same issues going through that assurance process when it comes to nature-based solutions. And I mean, historically, it's always been the thing that then drops out of the business case in favour of a clear engineered a clear investment case for an engineered solution.
Neil, did you have a comment on that?
Only, I'm not going to. I fully agree with everything that's the likes of Will, Roy, Mike, and everyone's been saying. The fragmentation of the funding is also a really big issue. There's so many little funding pots that do their own little thing, and ultimately, you know, we've got all these government departments that have their remits that they need to look after. So that's, I guess, why we have these funding pots. But ultimately, we're trying to do good things for the nation, and we probably need to get back to a common funding settlement so that we can just do these projects which are good for the nation and get them funded, and move away from, you know, the flood defence grants and aid and all these, you know, mindset.
You got a clap from Mike there.
Yeah, no,
in case you hadn't missed that.
I completely agree with that. I just think we are. I mean, if you look at the strategy is really promoting this holistic way of approaching the development of projects, so that we bring in all of these multiple outcomes and we look to deliver a wider set of benefits that secure both the EA's objectives, but also our key partner objectives. And that's brilliant as a sort of starting point. But then our processes are such that we develop that sort of holistic plan, and then we end up disaggregating all of our benefits into individual business cases to bid into a whole host of individual funding pots. And the two things just don't really marry up particularly well. And I'm fully aware that I'm just on my soapbox and moaning about stuff without actually providing any solutions. But I think these are real challenges that collectively as a community we need to start to address.
Yeah, they definitely are. And don't worry about being on your soapbox. This is a safe space. But it's true. It's almost like the strategy is being quite bold, but we haven't caught up in terms of what the rules actually say we can do. And that is definitely an issue. I've got a hand up here from Will. Did you have something else?
Sorry, yeah, I will stop talking in a sec.
No,
just,
it's good.
Just to say, you know, following that, Mike, well, and Chloe, I mean, we did some the modelling, or the trying to use some modelling to quantify the benefits, was something we did as part of our DEFRA NFM trial for the 15 million community and catchment based project that was started a few years ago. And part of the learning from that, something I'm really hoping I can try and do, is work with our national evidence and risk colleagues to maybe put something proportional approach, you know, a proportional approach forward to the assurance of projects that are sort of primarily using more nature-based solutions. So it sounds like Mike, you're sort of fully behind sort of that sort of approach, and so I mean it's really early days. So what I might do, I'm obviously keen to sort of get I guess at some point input and sort of from around other practitioners around the country. So I might well be in contact, Mike, to sort of just maybe have a chat and sort of learn from your experience with that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'd really welcome that discussion.
Brilliant, thank you. I mean, it's yeah, it may not go anywhere, but I think we want to try and use our learning from the trial, because that was the whole point of it. So yeah, that's the aspiration.
Brilliant, sounds great. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Will. I've got another hand up here from Rashid. Is that how? Sorry, is that how you say your name? Thanks.
Yeah,
Good.
Rashid,
Okay.
yeah, Chloe. Yeah, I suppose mine is probably what will be a more. It's more further understanding, really. Does nature-based solutions extend to include building nature? And by that I mean buying land and property and extending nature into areas where it should be. So quite often in my patch, you know, where we've got the main rivers, not I say within 50 meters of the centre line of that, you know, we get properties that flood. But is nature-based solution extending to say, yeah, you know what, I think we need to build back nature, and would NBS extend to include buying land, buying property? You know, what's the word to describe it? Not by force, but by consultation with the members of the board. Is that part of NBS, or should it be part of NBS? I'll end it there, Chloe.
Yeah, I'll open that to the group. It's quite an interesting comment, though. Do you mean, if we were to use like compulsory purchase powers? Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a forest manager, but I've got 18 plus years in highway development, building roads, and we could purchase a house, buy it, and have it demolished in 6 months. And we've got communities where flood, and I just think they could make great places to store water. But yet, I don't think any of the GIA or the NBS type funding allows us to do that. So what you find in small communities that flood, like maybe 4 houses, 5 houses, you're not going to find an NBS scheme that's going to support it. There's what BCR out there or any engineering defence scheme. It just makes so much sense to me to buy those 3-4 houses, which aren't going to be worth a lot because of flood, and give communities to move out, relocate, and then we can use where what appears to be naturally going, and to not fight nature, but to embrace it in areas where it's naturally going and rebuild back nature as it should have been. Okay, I'll end it there. Chloe.
Millie, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so as I said earlier, I'm working in this Interreg partnership. So this project's called Sustainable and Resilient Coastal Communities. So there's a group of us, there's 7 pilots. So I'm on the one in Cornwall, and then we buddy up with other areas in Europe. So we actually had a meeting on Tuesday with our kind of buddies in the Netherlands, a place called Vlissingen, and they're doing that in a urban setting, which is really interesting. So it's right on the coastline. What they're doing is that there's shame I don't have a diagram on me, but because of sea level rise with time, they are there's like a park. I don't know how to explain it. There's a park, and then in between, on the kind of coast, there's some houses and some roads, and then there's a road up to the park. And what they're doing is they're engineering that road so that with sea level rise, the water will then flow through the road and into the park and create a wetland area. And then as that time goes on, they will be then buying out those properties that are on that coastline, because eventually in a couple of 100 years time, those properties will get flooded, so people will need to move from there. So it was really interesting. I don't quite know what we do in England, but it was interesting seeing the mindset of those that are in the Netherlands, and they seem to be very forward thinking, and it seems like their communities maybe are a bit more accepting. I don't know, I'm going to put it out to the board, about sort of managed realignment and giving nature back in those urban settings. So that's an example for you.
Thanks, Millie. Yeah, that's really interesting. Mike, did you have a comment on that?
Just, yeah, I think it's a really important point, and I think in this country we're in a slightly different place because it's not especially politically palatable to accept that we need to sort of move out of areas and make space. And I'd just be interested if, and you may not know, but if there's any sort of spatial planning colleagues that have joined this session, because I think there is a really important role for sort of long-term planning around all of this, and actually building it into our long-term strategies for the way that we sort of manage our places within local authorities.
Well, I used to be a planner, if that counts. So I actually used to do spatial planning for Dartmoor National Park. But that kind of planning is incredibly difficult to do. And I touched on it a little bit in my presentation. Funding that move, especially for places on our coast, is going to be incredibly hard. I know they're doing it in I can't remember where. There's one place in the country where they're currently moving a community. I'll try and find the case study and share it with everyone after this. And that is working because the landowner has gifted the community the land to move back. So there's been no financial arrangement. He gifted the land and the community are all happy to move back. But this is going to be so important on our coasts, especially in Cornwall and Devon, where we've got these small, quite expensive locations. Someone with a £1 million property overlooking the sea is probably not going to want to move up the hill to lose their view into a little boxy new build. And I don't know the answer to this. I'm not sure we have the one, but I will open that up to everyone. But I do see it as an incredible challenge that I think will probably just become more and more important as we go forward, and is likely to become highly political in terms of the locations where some of those movement might be funded or not. But that's kind of my view on it. But open it up to others. Millie, did you have something else?
No, I think like back to the point of Emma Howard Boyd, we're kind of on the right track, that we are saying all the right key messages now, but it is that difficult sort of point of moving it from being a strategy to actually something that we're doing on the ground. And I think that's where we're stuck at now, isn't it? And what we're trying to figure out. But it would be interesting. It's great having this opportunity to work with international partners to see what they're doing, and if we can learn anything from them and from this project, that would be really useful. Neil, was that your hand up?
Yeah, I think we'll just come back to the mismatch between the strategy and what is funded yet again. And I think the conversation earlier was, basically FDI does not pay to to retreat, and partly it's the ratios. If you're paying a maximum of maybe 4.5, whatever, sort of 20p in the pound, isn't it? Then if you've got a house that's £250,000, you're not going to have the money to do it, and it's going to cost more than what the house costs, because you've got all the legal costs and to do it. So that needs to catch up. And I think until we have a serious conversation about what really are the damages of flooding, because it's not just the capped value of property. It's people end up stuck in these houses and they're living there for a long time, so that their damages are actually much, much higher than the cap value. So I think there's a big conversation like capping, and the UK is the only place in the world that does cap. So why are we doing it? Why are we only looking at part of the benefits of our flood schemes?
Yeah, that's a good point, Neil. I was also thinking as well, like we are starting to be better at pushing for nature-based solutions in projects, and we've got all these pilot funds out. And the session before, we spoke about the Innovative Resilience Fund. So things like that are coming out, but I don't know if anyone else agrees with me or finds this, but they come out and you don't have a very long time frame to write a bid for them. So these problems that are really difficult things to address, we end up rushing to write a bid for. So we can't think about it how we really need put the thought in that we actually really need to put into it, and then maybe we can't deliver exactly what we want to, or we can't do it in a joined up way with other partners like we would like to if we had a bit more time. I don't know if anyone else agrees.
Definitely agree.
Thanks.
Yeah, Neil's put a thumbs up. Yeah, and I think the most recent, well, a term that the government keeps using is shovel-ready projects, and actually it's very difficult for our projects to be shovel-ready. Shovel-ready, they should have had their funding lined up and actually ready to go. So that is something that, yeah, I contend with quite a lot in the funding arena. Have we just got 1 minute left, Millie? Just wanted to open up if anyone else has any questions or comments they want to say before.
We've actually got 6 minutes.
Oh,
It's
perfect.
20 past, so.
Okay, cool.
I'll put out another area of discussion then, moving to something a little bit differently. I don't know if anyone else has had experience working with the biodiversity calculator. I think it's DEFRA's biodiversity calculator. I don't know that much about it, but it's about quantifying the sort of benefits of different types of nature-based solutions, and it's quite an interesting one, because the way that it's calculated at the moment is it only quantifies the benefits from sort of the beginning of putting it. So for example, if you put in woodland, it will quantify that versus heathland, and heathland has a higher kind of credit than woodland does. So it means that some projects, they'll be putting in nature-based solutions that maybe aren't the most effective, but on paper, using the biodiversity calculator, they could get more funding for. So I'm going to put that out as a discussion point if anyone's had experience using it or thinks there's any improvements to it.
I've not used it, so I can't really comment. But just that sort of slight conflict there in itself is sort of, I suppose, displays to a certain extent what we're talking around, which is we're still looking at calculating benefits for a very specific purpose, rather than looking at that sort of the greater holistic gain. So yeah, from a biodiversity net gain perspective, a certain habitat type might bring in additional funding, but from a flood risk or nature-based solution type perspective, it may actually be more appropriate for that area. And I guess it's just having the flexibility within the process to be able to use the appropriate tools in the way that's best for that particular location.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess these are all very new sort of tools, and so they're not going to be perfect right now, and they are going to be flawed. But it is sort of ironing out those kind of issues and raising them now, isn't it? So that we can actually use them effectively instead of putting the wrong interventions in just because it's worth more on paper.
And before we finish, I was just wondering if we've got any international colleagues in this group, and if they could comment on how we fund versus how they do. Is it easier to fund nature-based solutions in other countries, or is it a similar kind of approach? But I'm not sure if we've got any international people on.